They said it would only be for a few weeks, just until things got settled. They used words like temporary and grateful and it'll help all of us. I remember standing in the hallway staring at the guest room as I stripped the old quilt off the bed, folding it slowly, the scent of lavender rising from the fabric. That room had been still for years, used only for holidays. Quiet visitors, the occasional grandchild, curled up under extra blankets after too much cocoa and too many stories. It had a kind of peace, that room, a waiting silence, and I gave it up with a soft smile and open hands. They brought boxes first, then bags, then a rhythm that became louder than mine. Mornings weren't mine anymore. The kitchen was never empty. The coffee pot, once enough for just me, was now brewing 2 rounds before I even touched it. At first I didn't mind. I thought I was helping. That's the part that stings the most. Now looking back, I thought I was doing something good. I made extra soup, left towels out, asked about their day. I even rearranged the linen closet to make room for their things. But little by little I noticed things disappearing, not physical things, but the unseen ones. My solitude, my control, the way sunlight used to fall through the living room window and paint silence across the rug, now interrupted by the flicker of a loud television or someone arguing on the phone. The hum of the house was no longer mine. I had lived in that house for 37 years. It had been the backdrop of my grief and my triumph, my marriage and my widowhood. I had painted every wall, chosen every tile, and yet within days I became a guest in my own home. They said I was being too sensitive, that I should be happy to have company, that they were doing me a favor by staying. A favor. I stood there washing the same mug for the 3rd time in a row and wondered when my home had turned into a favor. I didn't say anything. Not then. I nodded, smiled, offered them my favorite chair when they looked tired. I held it all close, the way old women do, pressed between heartbeats and tea steam. But the truth was, I had already started losing pieces of myself, not because they meant harm, no. I don't think they even saw it happening. That's the most dangerous kind of theft, the kind done in plain sight without even malice. Just entitlement, just forgetting that the woman who opens the door still breathes, still feels, still aches when ignored. I remember the first night they stayed. The guest room glowed under a warm lamp. I'd fluffed the pillows, made the bed with the blue sheets, the ones with little white blossoms. I even set a small glass of water on the nightstand like I used to do when my children were small. That night I sat in my room, the door half cracked, and listened to the new weight in the house. Their voices in the hallway, the quick thump of careless feet, and I felt it, my house shifting, as if it exhaled something old and inhaled something sharp and strange. It was subtle at first. I didn't have a name for it yet, just a sense that the corners didn't belong to me anymore, that my routines had to bend like my spine had bent with the years accommodating quiet tired. But one thing I've learned in my life is that shifts start small. An extra plate on the table, a late-night light left on, the laundry machine going without asking. And then suddenly, everything that was yours has become theirs, and you are left wondering when exactly the handover happened. But I smiled. I always smile. That's the thing with women like me. We were raised to make others comfortable, even when we're unraveling inside. I didn't want to seem unkind. I told myself it was just an adjustment. I reminded myself of all the years they had once needed me and how surely this was just my turn to give again. So I gave. I gave until the walls no longer echoed my breath, and they never even noticed. I used to think that getting older would earn me a kind of reverence, that after everything I'd done, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the holding it all together, when no one else could, I would one day be treated with the gentle respect owed to a woman who had weathered so many storms, but instead age made me invisible, or worse, convenient. And that's how it started to feel not long after they settled into the guest room, like I had become convenient. They never asked if I needed help with the laundry. They just dropped their clothes in the hamper like I was the one who needed something to do. Dishes piled higher than they ever had when it was just me. I wiped down counters behind them like a ghost chasing crumbs. I was told sweetly condescendingly that I shouldn't be lifting that much at my age. But the very next day they asked if I could water the plants, fold the blankets, sweep the porch, because you like that sort of thing, don't you? They spoke in suggestions, but the kind that corner you, that leave no room to say no without looking ungrateful or cold. Could you just became a daily phrase. Could I grab the mail? Could I heat up the leftovers? Could I pick up something from the store on my way back from the doctor's appointment that I didn't ask anyone to come to? One afternoon, I found myself on my knees scrubbing the kitchen floor, sweat gathering along my neck, my back aching from the effort. The smell of bleach stung my nose. I looked up and saw them stepping over me to grab a soda from the fridge without even acknowledging I was there. And in that moment, something cracked. Not loudly, just a hairline fracture, deep and quiet. They weren't cruel, not in the way you might think. They didn't shout or insult. They didn't raise fists or voices. Their cruelty was the kind that seeps in like dampness through old walls, unspoken but persistent, a slow wearing down. I was useful until I wasn't, and when I wasn't, I was tolerated. I remember one particular evening I had made dinner a nice roast chicken with rosemary from my little garden, the same recipe I used to make on birthdays. I even set the table the way I used to when the kids were little. Candles, cloth napkins, the good plates. Just for a moment, I wanted it to feel warm again, home again. They came in late, didn't notice the effort. One of them picked at their plate and asked if I'd used too much salt. The other never looked up from their phone. And just like that, the illusion of family dinner vanished like steam from the mashed potatoes. I excused myself before dessert, ate my slice of pie alone in the kitchen next to the recycling bin, with the light from the fridge spilling across my lap. After that, I stopped setting the table. I stopped using the good plates. I stopped trying. But they didn't notice that either. They began leaving their shoes in the hallway, tracking dirt across the clean floors. They'd use the last of the milk and not replace it. They forgot to flush more than once. My home, once my sanctuary, became a place I tiptoed through, like I didn't belong, like I was the one imposing. And the worst part, they called it helping me out. I didn't correct them. I couldn't. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, something in my chest tightened, like the words were too heavy to lift, too old to matter. And so I swallowed them, like pills, like pride, like so many things women like me are taught to keep quiet about. Some mornings I'd catch my reflection in the hallway mirror, a woman bent not by time but by tolerance. My eyes looked dimmer, my clothes a little more wrinkled, not because I didn't care, but because I was too tired to keep caring when no one else did. I began to wonder if this was what the rest of my life would look like, scrubbing floors for people who didn't say thank you, cooking meals for mouths that didn't pause to taste, fading quietly behind the very walls I once painted with joy. That thought made me sit down, right there on the couch in the middle of the afternoon, holding a dish towel and nothing else. I stayed there a long time. No TV, no sound, just me and the dust motes in the window light. And I thought maybe I am too old to say no, but I'm not too old to stop saying yes. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly, not because Tuesdays are special, but because that particular Tuesday was the day I realized something inside me was beginning to slip. I had driven to the market like I always did. Same parking spot, same quiet nod to the man who collected carts near the entrance. I even brought the list folded neatly in the pocket of my coat. But when I stood in front of the produce aisle staring at the oranges, I couldn't remember why I was there. It wasn't just the list. It was the feeling that nothing on that list mattered anymore. I stood frozen, one hand on the shopping cart, the other trembling slightly, not from age, but from something more subtle, something lonelier. There were people around me, voices moving like waves, laughter from the bakery counter, a child crying near the cereal boxes. But it all felt distant, muffled, like I was underwater. The list stayed in my pocket. I wandered the aisles in a haze, putting things into the cart, out of habit more than need. Soup I didn't crave. Bread I knew they'd eat before I had a slice. Almond milk, even though I missed real cream. My life had become a pattern of small compromises, not the loud kind, no. Just quiet erasures of what I liked, what I wanted, what I used to be. By the time I got home, I realized I had forgotten the butter. Again. And I just stood there in the kitchen bags at my feet, ashamed that I was angry. Angry at myself for forgetting. Angry at them for never offering to help. Angry at the silence that waited for me every time I came back to this house, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but punishing. I unpacked the groceries alone like always. No one came to the door to help. No one asked what I'd bought. They were upstairs laughing at a show I'd never seen, eating chips from a bag I hadn't bought. And I thought to myself, this house has become a hotel where the staff isn't paid. Later that evening, I tried to find that list again. I thought maybe it would anchor me, make me feel like I still had some thread of control left. But it was gone. I looked in all the usual places, coat pocket, countertop, even the trash. Nothing. That little piece of paper had vanished just like so many of my days seemed to vanish now, into the cracks between what I gave and what they took. That night I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, and I stared at the woman in the mirror. She looked faded, not broken, not yet, but less visible than before. And I asked her silently, is this it? Is this the version of you that will be remembered, a woman who drove through errands like a ghost, forgot lists, cooked for people who never said thank you? But I couldn't bring myself to cry. Crying would have made it real, and I wasn't ready for that. So instead I did what I've always done. I tucked the pain somewhere small, folded it like a note, hid it under my pillow with the hopes that sleep would erase it. But dreams don't come easy when your days are shaped by absence. And that night the silence in the house was deafening. No one knocked on my door. No one asked how my day had been. I lay in bed with the sheet pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling, counting the quiet, like it owed me something. And in that stillness a thought came, not loud, not sudden, but certain. They do not see you. They see the laundry, the dinners, the open door, the stocked fridge, but not you. And if they don't see me, I thought maybe it's time I make them look. There was a chair in the corner of the living room, mine, not because it cost anything extravagant or because anyone had gifted it to me, but because I had chosen it. Years ago, after my husband passed, I spent an entire weekend repainting the walls, rearranging the furniture, and trying to make peace with the quiet. That chair, a soft moss green, with a worn floral cushion, had cradled me through evenings of reading, dozing, and sometimes crying when no one was there to see. It faced the window just right, catching the sunset across the rooftops, like a slow golden apology for the day. And then one day it wasn't mine anymore. I walked into the living room with a fresh cup of tea, and there they were, sprawled in it, legs draped over the arm shoes on the fabric, scrolling through their phone like they owned the light coming through that window. My tea paused mid-step. I waited. They didn't notice. Or maybe they did, and that was worse. It wasn't just the chair. It was the rearrangement of what I held sacred. They moved the coaster's stacked books in the wrong order, turned the television volume so loud that the news anchor's voice echoed into the kitchen. They threw their jackets on the back of dining chairs, kicked their shoes into corners, left cups half full on the side tables. It was like they were erasing the home I had built one careless gesture at a time. Once I came home from a short walk just 20 minutes around the block, trying to shake the heaviness from my shoulders, and they had moved the chair, literally pushed it aside to make room for something else. I stood in the doorway staring at the void where it used to sit, and something in my chest clenched, like an old door shutting hard against the wind. I didn't say anything. I never did. I simply moved it back when they went upstairs, hands shaking slightly, breath tight. "You always get weird about furniture," they laughed once when I mentioned how I liked things arranged. "It's just a chair." But it wasn't just a chair. It was the last place in the house that still felt like mine. And now it was where they threw their backpack, where they dropped crumbs, where they sat, legs open, volume up, rules gone. And when I tried to push back just a little, they rolled their eyes, told me to relax, said I was being dramatic, that I should be happy the house was alive again. But alive isn't the same as respected. Noise isn't the same as love, and taking over isn't the same as belonging. They began choosing the TV shows without asking. They'd switch the channel midway, through something I was watching. They made fun of my old movies, scoffing at the black and white romance, as if nostalgia were a disease. One night I reached for the remote, and they snatched it playfully out of my hand, saying, "You've had your time, haven't you?" That sentence didn't leave me. "You've had your time." As if my time were over. As if I had no right to choose to sit, to exist with preferences and peace. I sat on the edge of the couch, awkward and displaced like a visitor in my own living room. And it occurred to me that I had stopped sitting in my chair altogether, not because I no longer wanted to, but because claiming it felt like starting a war. And maybe that was what hurt the most, that my home, my safe, quiet, lovingly kept home, had become a battlefield of invisible wars, wars of space, wars of sound, wars of respect. So I began waking up earlier. I'd sit in that chair at dawn before anyone stirred, wrapped in my robe tea warming my palms. Those early hours became sacred again, mine, just for a little while, until the day started and the world shifted back to theirs. But each morning I sat a little longer, breathed a little deeper, remembered who I was before the noise came, and slowly I began to ask myself the question I had avoided for too long. If they've taken my chair, my peace, my silence, what's left? And the answer that followed, gentle and grave, was only what I decide to keep. It began with small things, a cough here, a complaint there. They'd grown from the hallway call my name like I was a bell they could ring whenever discomfort struck. "Can you bring me some tea? Do we have aspirin? I didn't sleep well last night." And I'd go. Of course I'd go, because that's what mothers do, we go. But somewhere along the way it changed. It wasn't just tea and aspirin anymore. It was scheduling appointments, calling insurance, sitting in waiting rooms for hours while they scrolled their phone, and I sat quietly clutching a worn purse and a bottle of patience I'd long since emptied. I became their calendar, their chauffeur, their sounding board for every ache and twinge. I listened to symptoms I wasn't qualified to assess, watched them lay on the couch for days, without so much as folding the blanket they left behind. And the thing is, they weren't even that sick. They were just lazy. Lazy in the way that people become when they believe someone else will catch them every time they fall a little. They knew I would. They trusted I'd always be there, always say yes, always nod, and bring soup and rub shoulders and refill prescriptions. And I did for a long time, because deep inside me was that ancient wiring, that maternal thread that tugged at my spine and whispered, don't let them suffer, even if they don't deserve your softness anymore. But I wasn't their nurse. I wasn't trained to handle their moods or chase down medications or clean up after their forgetfulness. And still they expected. Not once did they say, do you have the energy? Or is this too much for you? Not once did they offer to arrange their own appointments. They simply sighed when things didn't arrive fast enough and groaned louder when I didn't leap into action. One morning I walked into the kitchen to find pill bottles strewn across the table. No labels, no organization, just chaos. I asked what was going on and they waved me off, said they had a system. Then they asked me to figure out which ones needed refilling. That was the moment something inside me started refusing, not loudly, not with a slammed door or a shouted word, just a quiet no buried deep under years of yes. A no that sounded like I am not your nurse. I am your mother, and I am tired. They stopped seeing me that way, though. I could feel it. I wasn't mom anymore. I was the help, the built-in assistant, the warm body who made their life easier, more comfortable, cheaper. That's what I had become, free labor wrapped in nostalgia. Once I suggested they look into assisted living programs, not out of malice, but out of concern for me, for them, for whatever thread of dignity remained. The silence that followed was so sharp, it could have cut through bone. They looked at me like I had slapped them, said I was trying to get rid of them, called me heartless, selfish. And yet here I was, emptying their trash, folding their clothes, checking their temperature, boiling rice, when their stomach hurt, whispering soft reassurances through gritted teeth, not because they deserved it, but because I was raised to carry burdens without complaint. But even strong backs buckle eventually. Even kind hands grow weary. I began counting how many times they asked for something each day. 10, 12, 15, more. I kept tally marks on a scrap of paper in the laundry room. It wasn't petty, it was survival. Proof to myself that I wasn't imagining it, that I had become a woman on call. And when I got sick, nothing serious, just a cold, I realized how invisible I truly was. No one asked if I needed soup. No one offered to pick up my prescriptions. No one noticed I hadn't eaten all day. I lay in bed, my head pounding the air thick with fever, and still I heard them downstairs calling, "Did you wash my socks yet?" That was the moment I knew. Not the breaking point, but the moment I marked quietly as the beginning of the end. Because I was not here to be used. I had given life, given love, given time and money and pieces of myself I never got back. But I would not give what remained of my strength to people who treated my care like currency they never intended to repay. There's a kind of silence that feels like prayer. That's what I used to have in this house mornings when the kettle hissed gently and sunlight moved across the wooden floorboards like it had nowhere else to be. The tick of the old wall clock, the hush of fabric as I folded laundry slowly with intention. My silence wasn't loneliness. It was peace. It was knowing I had earned the quiet after years of noise diapers, carpool runs, slammed doors, teenage outbursts. The calm I found in solitude felt like a reward. But now the house had changed its language. Noise had crept in like an uninvited guest, settled in every corner and refused to leave. They were loud in ways that felt careless. The television blared at all hours, crime shows, reality shows, endless reruns of people screaming at each other. The phone rang constantly, never silenced, always on speakerphone. They talked with their mouths full, left music playing in rooms they weren't even in, And when I asked gently if they could lower the volume just a little, they laughed. You just don't like any fun. It wasn't about fun. It was about the way the house no longer listened to me. Even the doors started slamming more often. Cabinet doors, bedroom doors, front doors. They banged them without thought, and each bang landed in my bones. The kitchen, once my sacred space, now felt like a cafeteria. Dishes clattered without care. Crumbs on the floor, spills left to dry. They made their coffee strong and left the grounds where they fell. I'd find mugs everywhere, on the windowsill beside the bathtub, behind cushions, and none of them were mine. Once I tried lighting a candle during the afternoon, hoping to reclaim something soft, but the scent of lavender barely made it past the burnt bacon from their brunch, the perfume cloud they sprayed right outside my door, or the reek of some takeout box left open overnight. And don't get me started on the guests. They had people over constantly, friends, loud acquaintances, strangers to me, but somehow always comfortable enough to kick off their shoes and sprawl across my sofa. They used my things, laughed at jokes I didn't understand, looked at me like I was just a fixture in the background. Someone's mother, someone's landlord, not a person, not a woman, just something vaguely in the way. One night I came downstairs in my robe thinking everyone had gone home. I wanted a glass of water. That's all. Just a drink, maybe a minute, to look out at the stars through the kitchen window. But there they were, still talking, still laughing. One of them glanced at me, looked me up and down, and whispered something to the person beside them. They both laughed. I didn't ask what it was. I just turned around, went back upstairs, and drank from the bathroom sink. It's strange how a house can betray you. How the things you chose, the wallpaper, the throw blankets, the quiet paint colors, can become unfamiliar under someone else's rules. The lamp that once made the corner feel warm now flickered beside a pile of their laundry. The books I loved were gathering dust while their junk mail piled high. Even the cat, old and slow, seemed confused by the shift in atmosphere, no longer curling in his usual spot, wandering restlessly from room to room. I started taking longer walks just to hear my own footsteps again, just to feel the rhythm of my breath, unaccompanied by someone else's noise. I'd walk past houses on quiet streets, glancing into windows that glowed amber and still. I envied the solitude behind those curtains. Not the loneliness, no, I've never feared being alone. What I feared now was the erasure of what I had built, what I had earned. Sometimes I sat in my car in the driveway before going back inside. Just a few minutes of stillness. I'd close my eyes, listen to the rain tapping the windshield or the wind brushing the mirrors, and pretend that I lived somewhere else. Somewhere where quiet was honored, where my breath didn't have to compete with a stereo or a slamming drawer or someone shouting into a phone. I didn't tell them how I felt. There was no point. They would have said I was being dramatic, sensitive, rigid. They always had a word to flatten my feelings into something small, and I was tired of being made small. But I was starting to collect these moments. I was beginning to stack them one on top of the other, like firewood for something not yet burning, but soon. Because if they couldn't hear me in the silence, maybe it was time I spoke through absence. I sat in the stiff waiting room chair, flipping through an outdated magazine I couldn't focus on, the kind with glossy pages and smiling people selling things no one over 50 truly needs. Across from me sat my daughter, my own child, though lately she felt more like an overseer than family. Her leg bounced impatiently, eyes fixed on her phone, thumbs dancing. I could feel the heat of her presence, not from closeness, but from that simmering impatience. I'd grown used to the kind that says, "You're lucky I'm even here." It had been her idea to schedule the checkup. "You're not remembering things like you used to," she'd said. Not unkindly, but with a firmness that didn't leave space for denial. I had agreed more out of exhaustion than consent. I didn't want to be a burden. I just wanted the conversation to end. When the nurse called my name, I stood slowly. My knees ached, as they always did, but I didn't complain. I rose with as much dignity as I could gather and followed her down the hallway, my daughter trailing behind, still tapping on her screen. Inside the small exam room, it was cold. The paper on the table crinkled loudly beneath me, too loud for how small I felt. The doctor came in, a young man with a kind enough face, but it was my daughter he looked at when he spoke. So what concerns are we seeing we? As though I wasn't there, as though the aches and foggy thoughts in my own body weren't mine to explain. She's been forgetting a lot lately, she answered quickly, like grocery lists or repeating stories or misplacing things. I opened my mouth to say something, to explain that everyone forgets things, that I'd been juggling too much, that no one ever helps, but the words tangled on my tongue. I felt small again, reduced, like a patient number, like a subject to be studied, not a woman with a full, aching life behind her eyes. The doctor nodded, scribbled something down, asked a few basic memory questions. I answered them just fine, I thought, but still he spoke to her, not to me. We'll want to keep an eye on things. Early signs can be subtle. Subtle. The word rang in my ears like a warning bell. When we got back to the car, she sighed heavily. Don't worry, Mom, I'll keep track of your pills from now on. Just like that, another freedom gone. I stared out the window as she drove the city blurring past. I wanted to tell her I wasn't slipping. I was just tired. Tired from doing everything for everyone, all while being slowly erased. But I knew she wouldn't hear me, not really, because she had already made up her mind. And when people do that, when they decide you are old or broken or fading, they stop listening. They stop seeing. That night I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to remember the last time someone had asked how I was without expectation, without agenda. Not my blood pressure or cholesterol, not how many steps I'd taken that day, but me, my soul, my mind, the dreams I still held under my breath like prayers. I couldn't remember. And that's when I realized the forgetting they feared wasn't the forgetting I feared. They feared I'd forget their birthdays, their needs, the doctor appointments. I feared they had already forgotten that I am still a whole person. I lit a candle and stared at the flickering flame. It danced stubborn and small, like the part of me that still refused to go out. That flame inside me, the one that remembered who I had been long before they arrived and started speaking for me. Let them watch me closely. Let them whisper about early signs and caretakers and checklists. Because what they don't see is that I am remembering too. I'm remembering everything they've taken, and soon I would start taking it back. There was a rhythm to my Sundays once, the kind that wrapped around you like a well-worn shawl. I'd wake early, not from obligation, but from habit, my body attuned to the gentle quiet of morning light. I'd pad softly into the kitchen, boil water for tea, and let the sound of the kettle mark the beginning of my sacred hours. I'd set a plate with toast, sometimes eggs, sometimes fruit, depending on the season. And then I'd sit right there at the table by the window, the sun slow dancing across the tablecloth, and I'd read. Not the news, not noise, books, old ones, poetry mostly. Sometimes letters I had written to myself in the margins. I'd read slowly, like each sentence was something to be tasted. Those mornings were never lonely. They were mine, entirely unquestionably mine. Until they weren't. It started with the television, loud and early. News anchors arguing over things none of us could change. The smell of microwave breakfast sandwiches wafting into my soft morning like a fast food invasion. I tried to keep my ritual tea toast book in hand, but their presence was louder than volume. They clanged plates, argued over laundry, shouted to each other from room to room, like the house was a train station and not a home. They didn't ask if I minded. They didn't even see that they had stepped into something delicate. Once I set the table with 2 extra mugs, thinking maybe I could share it with them. Maybe if I invited them into my stillness, they'd tread softly. Maybe they'd see. But they took their mugs, muttered a distracted thank you, and went right back to their noise. The TV went up, my book went down. The next week, I didn't bother setting extra mugs, and I stopped reading altogether. What surprised me more than anything was how easily they dismissed my stories, not just the ones in books, but the ones I tried to share. A memory of a garden I once grew, a song I used to sing, a lesson I'd learned the hard way. They'd listen, if at all, with that vacant, polite smile, the kind people wear when they're waiting for you to stop talking. One Sunday, I began telling them about the time I got lost on a train in my 20s, and how a kind woman with red gloves gave me directions back home. Halfway through the story, my daughter glanced up from her phone and said, "You told us that already." Maybe I had, maybe I hadn't. But what cut deep wasn't the correction. It was the way she said it, as if the story itself had no worth, because it wasn't new. As if my memories were clutter, not treasure. After that, I stopped offering them. I became quieter in their presence, not because I lacked things to say, but because I knew they wouldn't listen. Not really. They didn't understand that when an old woman speaks, she's not just telling a story, she's offering a piece of the thread that holds her life together. So I gave up my Sunday mornings. I stopped waking early. I stayed in bed longer, staring at the ceiling, listening to the noise from downstairs creep under my door like a tide I couldn't hold back. And still they never noticed, never knocked to ask if I'd join them, never asked if I missed the quiet. They assumed I was just resting more. They assumed all kinds of things. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't resting. I was grieving. Grieving the loss of my rituals, of my time, of being a woman who could begin her day with joy instead of endurance. I began writing little notes to myself tucked inside my books, scraps of thought, small rebellions. One said, "They can steal the hours, but not the knowing of what they meant." Another said, "Let them take the noise. You'll find silence again." It became my secret act of resistance, my way of keeping my voice alive when they'd made me feel mute. Because while they thought I was fading into the background, I was in truth retreating to the edges to observe, to remember, to wait. And Sunday by Sunday, something was beginning to rebuild in me, not anger, but clarity, not bitterness, but resolve. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. But I was still here, still remembering, still watching the light shift across the table in the morning, waiting for the moment I would take it all back. I hadn't planned it. I wish I could say there was some grand cinematic moment where I stood tall in the doorway, threw down a folder of financial documents, and declared my independence like a war cry. But the truth was quieter, smaller. It started with an overheard sentence, one they never meant for me to hear. I was in the hallway, moving slowly, as I always do now, holding a laundry basket full of their things, socks, t-shirts, a sweater I'd folded with more care than it deserved. They were in the kitchen laughing the kind of laugh that doesn't consider who might be listening, and one of them said it. "She's lucky we're here, rent-free, and still acts like she owns the place." The words didn't land like an explosion. No, they settled heavy and thick somewhere behind my ribs. I stood there, still laundry basket cradled in my arms like a child. Rent-free. That's how they saw it. Not as a gift, not as hospitality, not as the open door of a woman who had once rocked them to sleep and paid every bill with hands that shook less than they do now. They thought I was the one who owed. I set the basket down gently at my feet. I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe for a moment. The air felt sharp, like a betrayal in winter. They kept talking. I heard the clink of glasses, the rustle of snack bags, the light click of the remote. My life treated like a living room lounge. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, my eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling I had once patched myself. I thought about all the rent I had paid in silence, all the emotional mortgages, all the decades of effort, cooking, cleaning, comforting, stretching $1 into $3 to make sure they always had enough. And here they were mocking the very roof they lived under. Rent-free. The next morning I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my little green ledger, the one I used to use when money was tight and I had to track every penny. I hadn't opened it in years, but it still smelled of ink and habit, and as I turned the pages I remembered what it felt like to be in control. I listed the cost of utilities, the groceries, the maintenance, the repairs. I added up the hours I spent cleaning, cooking, waiting in doctors' offices, picking up prescriptions, being available like a lamp they could switch on and off at will. And then I opened my laptop. It took me all afternoon, but I did it. I drafted a rental agreement. Nothing aggressive, just fair, room and board, utilities, a small stipend for housework, market value. Not quite, but enough to make a point, enough to draw a line that had been missing for far too long. I printed 2 copies, slid them under their doors, and went to bed. They didn't mention it that night. I half expected a tantrum. What I got was worse dismissiveness. The next morning, one of them said with a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes, "Are you serious about this?" I looked up from my toast. "Very." "But we're family," he said, as if that word had weight after everything they'd dropped at my feet. "Yes," I said softly, "and I've been paying for that." The house grew quiet in the way only guilt can cause. They didn't respond. Just walked away muttering something under their breath. I didn't ask what. Days passed. The air changed. The entitlement thinned like morning fog after a strong sun. They started picking up after themselves more, asking before changing the thermostat. They didn't pay not yet, but I had handed them something more valuable than a bill. I had reminded them that I saw everything, that I had been keeping track, that I had boundaries now. They called me cold behind closed doors. I heard them, said I was petty, said I was being dramatic, said maybe they should move out. And I sat in my chair finally unoccupied again, and sipped my tea. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no, I simply waited. Because they needed to understand that generosity without respect is not love. And I had been generous for far too long. There's something ceremonial about opening old folders, the sound of paper, the weight of documents aged by time and touch. That day I sat down at the dining table, the same one we used to gather around for birthdays and holidays, and I brought out the file box from the hallway closet. It had everything: mortgage records, receipts, insurance policies, my will. Things most people wouldn't think a woman like me would keep in such perfect order. But I did. I always have. I pulled out the house deed first, my name etched in ink that hadn't faded one bit over the years. I ran my hand over it slowly like it was something sacred, because in truth it was. That house had been the one constant in my life, a place I built, kept, and protected. A place that raised children and buried a husband, a place that had become my refuge and my prison. As I flipped through the pages, I began making notes. Rent values in the area, property tax increases, utility costs, food expenses, medical bills, the hidden costs of being taken for granted. It wasn't about money, not really. It was about worth, about assigning numbers to the endless invisible labor I'd performed, making life livable for people who now treated my kindness like wallpaper there but no longer seen. I made a list of every bill I'd paid without a word. I calculated interest, not financial, but emotional. Interest on the years of swallowed feelings, the strained smiles, the quiet yeses that should have been no. Then I turned to my will. I had written it years ago before things got messy, back when I still believed in family ties as something unbreakable. I had divided everything evenly, like a good mother is supposed to. Fair, predictable, loving. Fair. But now I picked up the pen. I didn't make loud cuts. I made strategic ones, adjusted figures, reassigned items, created notes and stipulations clauses that only a woman scorned would think to include. I added the cost of my silence, of my solitude, of the mornings I was talked over, the evenings I was ignored, the stories that went unloved. And most of all, I made space for myself. I appointed a legal executor outside the family, a woman from my book club, kind, discreet, no nonsense. I made sure the instructions were clear. Do not inform them of these changes until after I am gone, not out of spite, but because I no longer owed them the comfort of preparation. They had been living as though they'd inherited everything already. The house, the comfort, my patience, my time. But inheritance must be earned. Later that afternoon, I sat with a notary at the bank. Gray suit, brief nod, professional. She didn't ask why I was making the changes. She saw it in my eyes. I imagined she'd seen it before. Older women coming in alone, with folders and quiet fury. Everything looks in order, she said, stamping the pages one by one. I walked out of that bank lighter than I had felt in months. I didn't tell them about the changes. Not yet. There was power in withholding, in knowing that the ground beneath them had shifted and they wouldn't feel it until it was too late. That evening they were watching television again, volume high, voices louder. I stood in the hallway watching the back of their heads, the careless sprawl of limbs across my furniture. I held the folder against my chest, felt the warmth of it, the finality. They didn't turn around. They didn't notice. And I thought to myself, you're not the heirs you think you are. You're just tenants now. Tenants with no lease and no gratitude. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled. Not a sad smile, not a bitter one. A real smile. Because I had taken back what was mine, not with shouting, not with tears, but with ink and intention. They didn't know it yet, but the world they lived in, the one I had paid for, cared for, held together, it was no longer theirs by default. It was mine again. And soon they would learn what rent really means. They didn't believe me at first. They thought the new rent notice tucked under their door was some kind of passive-aggressive warning, a scare tactic, a bluff. They laughed over it in the kitchen like it was a joke only they were in on. She's just upset, one of them said. She'll calm down. She always does. But I didn't. I didn't explain or argue or justify. I let the paper speak. Triple the rent. Utilities itemized. Cleaning fees clearly stated. A deadline printed in bold. And beneath it all, my signature, small, steady final. The next morning they confronted me, of course. It wasn't fury at first, just amusement dressed in arrogance. You can't be serious, they said, waving the notice like it was a scrap of trash. You know we can't afford this. I met their eyes calmly. Then you'll need to make other arrangements. Silence. It was the first time they'd heard me speak with something harder than kindness. The first time I saw confusion in their eyes, not because they didn't understand the words, but because they didn't understand me anymore. But "We're family," one of them whispered, as if that still held currency. I nodded. "Yes, we are. And that's why I've let you live here for months without contribution. That's why I cooked, cleaned, drove you to appointments, and gave up every quiet corner of this house. Because I believe that's what family did for each other." They opened their mouth to respond, but I raised a hand, not loudly, not rudely, just enough to pause whatever excuse was forming. "But family," I continued, "also shows respect. Family asks before they take. Family doesn't make you feel like a stranger in your own home. You've had the benefit of my silence. Now you'll live with the consequence of my decision." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply walked past them and poured myself a glass of water. The faucet dripped into the glass like a metronome, steady and indifferent. Behind me, they stood frozen, as if the house itself had turned on them. Later that day, I heard them on the phone calling friends looking at apartment listings. I didn't interfere. I didn't ask if they needed help packing. I had given them everything. This was theirs to handle. They moved through the house like shadows that had overstayed their welcome. A little quieter now, a little more careful. They picked up after themselves. They started doing their own laundry again, but it was too late. One of them tried to negotiate, said they could pay something, just not the full amount. I looked at them gently. "You've had more than a year of living here without giving anything back. That debt is not just financial, it's trust. And trust once lost doesn't get a discount." They didn't argue after that. Instead, they sulked, pouted like children, tried to guilt me with stories about stress and pressure and how hard life was. I nodded. I didn't disagree. Life is hard. But so is aging in a house full of people who treat you like the help. So is giving without thanks. So is watching your own home become foreign. Tripling the rent wasn't revenge. It was a mirror. It was holding up a reflection of the value they had never acknowledged. And if they thought that living off of me was free, because I didn't send them a bill, they were wrong. Every sigh I swallowed was interest. Every quiet concession was a tax. And now the ledger was due. I began locking my door at night, not because I feared them, but because it felt good to reclaim even that small boundary. I made tea again in the morning, read quietly without interruption. For the first time in months, I felt the house settling, as if it too had been waiting for me to choose myself. There was a lightness in my step that hadn't been there in years. And still they sulked. Still they whispered behind my back. But now their whispers no longer held power, because they were tenants with notice. And I was no longer a woman who allowed her silence to be mistaken for permission. It came as I suppose all storms do, without warning, and with far too many words. I was in the kitchen slicing apples for a pie. I suddenly felt like baking for no one in particular, just for the simple comfort of peeling skin from fruit and watching the cinnamon swirl into sugar. The oven hummed warm and familiar when one of them barged in, red-faced and breathless. "This is cruel," they spat. "We're your family. You can't just evict us." I didn't flinch, not even a blink. They stood there, waiting, perhaps expecting me to crumble to apologize, to reach for the soft place in my chest that they'd relied on for too long. But I just kept slicing, slowly, carefully. Each slice clean and deliberate, like punctuation on a sentence I was finally writing for myself. "I'm not evicting you," I said calmly. "I'm charging you rent, like any adult would be expected to pay." Their voice rose, loud, sharp, frantic. They threw words like stones, selfish, cold, ungrateful. That last one nearly made me laugh. Me, ungrateful. For what exactly? For having my time, my space, my peace invaded and consumed. They called me delusional, accused me of losing my mind, said maybe the doctor was right to be concerned. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that particular weapon disguised as worry. The cruelest things they ever said came wrapped in the silk of concern. But this time their voices didn't shake me. This time I stood tall. I placed the knife gently on the counter and turned to face them, hands, steady eyes clear. "You are shouting at a woman who gave you her life," I said. "Not once have you asked how I'm doing. Not once have you said thank you. I have loved you in ways that cost me pieces of myself I will never get back. And still you come in here like I owe you more." They opened their mouth, but I raised my hand softly, but with finality. "I am not the one who has forgotten love. You are." The room went quiet then, that deep, echo-less silence that follows something true. They stared at me like I had grown thorns. But I wasn't growing thorns. I was reclaiming my roots. They left the room in a flurry, muttering under their breath, slamming a door somewhere upstairs. The sound vibrated through the house, but not through me. Not anymore. I turned back to my apples, finished the pie. The smell of cinnamon and butter filled the kitchen, a scent older than their anger, stronger than their guilt. I placed the pie on the windowsill like I used to, when the kids were small, when the world still felt simple and kind. Later, I heard them walking up and down the hallway, testing the atmosphere, trying to decide how much of me was left to push against. But I had changed, not in fire, but in stone, still, unmoving, whole. They didn't know what to do with a woman who no longer needed to explain herself. So they did what people like that always do. They tried to pull others in, called family, whispered poison, twisted truth into vines. I heard from an old cousin the next day, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, calling me difficult, gently accusing me of being out of touch. I smiled, told her I was doing fine. Because I was. For the first time in years, I was fine. Their noise didn't reach me anymore. Their shouting didn't echo in a house where dignity had returned. I brewed tea that night and sat in my chair bathed in the quiet. The pie had cooled. I cut myself a slice and ate slowly, letting each bite remind me that sweetness can still exist after bitterness. They still sulked, still fumed, still walked too hard down the hallway to remind me of their presence. But I let them have their tantrums. Because you cannot argue with someone who refuses to lower herself to shouting. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. And now every room in this house echoed with it. There was a time I never locked the door to my bedroom. It wasn't necessary. The house felt safe and my room was my sanctuary. The thought of needing separation from my own family had once felt absurd, unthinkable even. But the night after the argument in the kitchen, I slid the bolt across the latch with a firm, satisfying click. And to my surprise, I slept better. It wasn't about fear. It wasn't that I thought they'd do anything harmful. It was something deeper, something quieter. It was about permission, about claiming space again in a house where I'd been pushed into corners. That one small sound of the lock falling into place. It sounded like a hymn, like a prayer whispered in wood and metal. For the first time in months, I had boundaries. I woke up the next morning and didn't dread the hallway. I moved freely through the house, not waiting to be interrupted or instructed. I brewed my coffee and drank it in silence. I didn't ask who needed breakfast. I didn't set out extra mugs or remind anyone to take their vitamins. I simply was. They noticed the change of course, the door, the distance, the absence of effort on my part. One of them knocked soft at first, then louder. "Are you okay?" they asked, like the question itself might undo months of erasure. "I'm fine," I said through the door, "just resting." But the truth was, I wasn't resting, I was repairing. Inside that locked room, I lit candles. I rearranged my drawers. I moved my old photos back onto the nightstand, the ones I had tucked away, because they said the house was starting to feel like a museum. I ran my hands over those faces, my husband in his suit on our wedding day, my babies before they forgot to call me. I stared at them long and hard, as if memorizing the warmth I used to carry in my bones. I cleaned, not because it was needed, but because it was mine to do. My space, my pace. I polished the wood frame of the bed. I fluffed the pillows. I even opened the window and let the air sweep through fresh and clean, untainted by noise or demand. That night I sat in the armchair by the window, another piece they'd once tried to claim, and I opened a journal I hadn't touched in years. I wrote for hours. Nothing profound, just truth. Small observations. The way the late sun touched the curtains, the silence that now curled at my feet like an old cat returning home. The fact that I no longer needed to answer every call, every knock, every unspoken expectation. Down the hall they still moved like they owned the place, but their footsteps had lost their certainty. There was hesitation in the way they walked now, a question in every door creak, because they didn't know who I was anymore. And maybe in some ways I didn't either. But I was beginning to find her again. The woman who used to sing while folding sheets. The woman who used to dance barefoot in the kitchen when no one was watching. The woman who once knew the joy of solitude not as punishment, but as peace. They tried to invite me to dinner that week, half-hearted and forced. "We're ordering Thai," they said. "Want anything?" I looked up from my knitting and smiled. "No, thank you. I've already eaten." I hadn't, but it didn't matter. I sat in my locked room that night, eating soup I'd made earlier, letting each spoonful remind me that caring for yourself is not the same as shutting others out. It's choosing presence over performance, peace over pretense, self over service. The door stayed locked every night after that, not to keep them out, but to let me in, into my own quiet, my own decisions, my own little world that didn't shrink every time they opened their mouths or rolled their eyes. A locked door is not an act of aggression, it is a declaration that I am still here, that I deserve stillness, that this house, this room, this body is mine. They didn't even say goodbye. That was the part I hadn't anticipated. After all the shouting, the justifications, the passive-aggressive silences, I thought there might be one final confrontation, a dramatic exit perhaps, or at the very least a last plea. But no, they just left. I heard it in the sounds, the shuffle of boxes, the low thud of a suitcase dragged down the stairs. A door opened, then closed. No knock on mine. No words slipped beneath the threshold. I sat on the edge of my bed listening as they peeled themselves away from the walls they had once claimed. Footsteps, then silence, and then the house breathed again. I didn't rush out to watch. I didn't stand at the window peering between curtains. I stayed seated, hands folded in my lap, a warm cup of tea untouched on the nightstand. My heart didn't race. My chest didn't tighten. I just existed, steady, grounded, like the house had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Eventually I rose and walked slowly through the halls, empty now. Their doors open, rooms cleared in a way that felt more like abandonment than departure. There were traces, of course, a sock under the radiator, a charger cord still plugged into the outlet in the guest room, fingerprints on the mirror too fresh to fade, but their presence was gone. No apology, no thank you, not even a scribbled note on the kitchen counter. And yet I didn't feel grief. I didn't feel relief either, not exactly. What I felt was clarity, a strange expansive stillness, as though the house had returned to its original shape, Every room, every chair, every echo felt familiar again. Mine. I walked into the kitchen and opened the windows wide. Let the morning air sweep in cool and bright. I stood there for a long time, just breathing. The clink of wind chimes outside, the rustle of leaves, the refrigerator humming softly. It all sounded like music after months of shouting and footsteps and television static. The guest room was bare. I stepped inside and ran my hand along the window frame. The bed was stripped mattress bare, but the light still fell in just the way it used to, gentle and golden. I smiled at that. Not a triumphant smile, just the quiet kind born of remembering. I didn't rush to clean. I didn't feel the need to erase their presence. It wasn't about revenge or removal. It was about restoration, reclaiming the room slowly, on my own time. I returned to the hallway closet and took out the old quilt, the one with lavender stitched into the seams, the one I had folded away the day they arrived. I laid it gently over the bed, smoothing the corners. Then I added a small glass of water to the nightstand just as I used to. Not for guests, not for them, but for memory, for the woman I had been before they came in and called her unnecessary. By late afternoon, I sat on the porch with a book I hadn't opened in over a year. The chair creaked beneath me, familiar and firm. The sky was soft, the breeze steady. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. A neighbor's dog barked lazily. The world hadn't changed, but I had. And in that moment, I realized I didn't miss them. Not their footsteps, not their voices, not their chaos. I missed myself. And now she was here again. Later, when I walked back inside, I paused in the entryway and looked around. Not at what was missing, but at what had returned. The space, the order, the energy. There was no longer a fight in the air, no tension crouched in corners. Just peace. It struck me then that the most powerful decisions aren't made in anger. They're made in silence, in resolve, in the unshakable knowing of what you deserve. And that day I knew I had chosen myself, not with fire, but with quiet. And they had left without packing their guilt, their noise, or their entitlement, which meant I didn't have to carry any of it either. The silence felt different now, not the heavy, suffocating kind I had once tried to fill with activity and obligation. This was a lighter silence, airy, clean, full of room to breathe. It didn't press against me. It embraced me. It greeted me in the morning when I padded across the floor to the kitchen. It kept me company in the evenings as I stirred soup for one. It wrapped around the house like a protective shawl woven with threads of my own choosing. I started moving through the rooms again like they belonged to me, not rushing, not stepping lightly, but with presence, with ownership, the way you walk when you know no one is watching. When the house no longer demands anything of you and instead offers only comfort. I played music again, not loud, not grand, just a little classical on the radio in the afternoons, the kind that sounds like soft rain falling on memory. I let it drift through the living room, mixing with the golden light from the windows, and I caught myself humming along. I hadn't hummed in months. I made small changes too, rearranged the bookshelves, brought the good dishes back down, started baking more often, not because anyone expected it, but because the scent of vanilla and browned butter made me feel like I was tending to something sacred. The guest room. I turned it into a reading nook. I moved in an armchair, a little table, a lamp with a warm amber glow. I stacked my favorite books in neat piles and added a tiny rug, the kind that makes your toes curl with happiness. It no longer felt like a space borrowed or imposed upon. It felt like mine. One afternoon, I opened the old wooden chest at the foot of my bed, the one I hadn't dared touch in years. Inside were letters, photographs, bits of lace, and a few forgotten treasures from my youth. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the sun casting long stripes across the carpet, and I read every word. I let the past rush in, not to hurt, but to remind. And it reminded me of who I had been before I was ever someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's caretaker. I was a girl who used to write poetry on napkins, a woman who once walked out of a job that didn't respect her, a wife who built a home with her bare hands and relentless heart, a mother who gave everything even when she had nothing left. And now I was a woman who had taken herself back. I didn't tell anyone they'd moved out. No phone calls, no family updates. I didn't explain, because explanations often come with justifications, and I owed no one those. I let the silence be my story. Sometimes when the mail arrives, I still expect a letter from one of them, some apology scrawled in ink, some soft regret. But it never comes, and I've stopped hoping it will. Regret is only worth something if it comes before the damage is done, and theirs never did. I've learned to let that go too. The wind sounds clearer now through the trees. The creak of the floorboards no longer carries the tension of someone pacing with impatience or entitlement. The very bones of the house seem to have settled back into place, as if they too had been holding themselves unnaturally for too long. I sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sun drip slowly below the roof lines. I sip my tea, I close my eyes, and I listen not for footsteps or shouting or need, but for nothing, for stillness. And in that stillness I hear myself again, the woman I was, the woman I am, the woman I will never give away so easily again.